All right, so we're stepping into May with some short reviews, and these are for the first 2 weeks of May. There's 7 releases here that I'm covering, and basically we're touching upon what I think are the better, more interesting releases from these first couple weeks that I just didn't have time to review, or in the next edition of short reviews will have records that I think are a little bit more essential than these, but I figured these were the ones that people were most likely to talk about because of their quality and maybe some of their more unique traits in some of these. We'll start out with a fairly standard death metal album from Unearthly Rites. This is a Finnish death metal band who are not necessarily aiming for the most classic sense of Finnish death metal, although this is kind of a sludge influenced kind of punkish thing that is maybe comparable to certain records from Coffins or Ilsa, in the sense that there's those sludgy down-tuned grooves and there's kind of a punk spirit to what they're doing. They're variously chaotic, but also heavy and sort of brutal in another sense. It's definitely an old school death metal attuned type of thing, but not necessarily the first thing you think of in terms of a Finnish death metal sound. So I like that this was a little bit surprising in what they had to offer here. There are some solid grooves on here. It's a pretty decent album with a nice cavernous sound. So not exactly To Secrecy and not exactly Coffins, but if you like those two things, this is probably a band worth watching. They're pretty young and ready to go, so I'm sure they'll have more to do with this sound in the future. So that's worth checking out from my point of view. Moisson Livide is a side project from the fellow behind Boisson Divine, and that's a folk metal band if you're not familiar. I wasn't familiar with either one. This band is something very different. They're finding a relationship between melodic black metal and folk metal, but also working in power metal as sort of the glue that bonds those two things, and that basically works pretty well. There's kind of a weird band in the way that they develop melody. They are going for there's a mix of melodic power metal ideas, but also the melodic black metal ideas that are, again, a little bit of a medieval type thing from Vehemence or Arlach. Unpredictable. It's a little bit, it's having a little bit of fun. There's certainly a French feeling attitude where it's not like they're not serious, but they're playing with melody and regional folk music in a way that is characteristic of where they're from. They've not gotten the fusion of elements entirely right to make it a memorable event. For me, as a fan of this style, I think it's an exuberant, kind of exciting mixture of power metal and black metal ideas. There's certainly a knack to it. It's interesting, but it's a first draft. It's certainly a first record, and I think that it doesn't feel so substantial that I wanted to really stick with it in the long term. So at some point last year, Stargazer, the Australian avant-garde black and death metal band, released a EP, a different session that was recorded after their most recent record, Psychic Secretions, and I didn't realize that it released. I never got any news about it. I didn't get the promo, and so I didn't hear about this until it was a little bit too late in the year for me to sort of touch upon it, and never ended up reviewing it or including it in any of my general proceedings. So this is my chance to talk about it as a huge fan of this band. This is one of my favorite bands, and I was excited to hear this record in full. This is Personal Records CD edition of this release, and I think the other editions were through Nuclear War Now, which includes vinyl and cassette. So those have been available for a while. This is a well-known release to most people at this point, and it generally does meet up with the quality and the style of Psychic Secretions, although I would say these songs are written in a little bit more of a knotted way that with a lot more quick changes that we'd found on Emerging with the Boundless, and I loved that record. So I was a big fan of what this EP does, and I think it's 3 songs. Obviously it's Stargazer, so it's going to be a substantial release, and it felt like there might not have been a big push behind it, but if you're as much of a fan as I am, it's certainly worth talking about, and it obviously comes with a very high recommendation from me. And what that motivates, don't mess around. This second full-length album from Ukrainian funeral death doom metal project Fretting Obscurity is certainly a very classic example of funeral death doom metal, where death metal still counts for a lot of the way that they put this thing together. There are doom metal riffs in there, but the pacing is slow. It is glacial. It is very much feels like an old school mid 90s funeral doom metal record. In terms of its sound quality, its focus on rhythms, and the way that it develops an eerie feeling that is not necessarily as gothic as maybe a Thorgothan record or something like that, but it still feels like it's in that style. And the way they balance that out, the way they kind of carry through the layers and make it interesting, is through a lot of leads, a la some pretty clear inspiration from Mournful Congregation. Otherwise, it's a pretty simple result. There's no real points of irritation. There's nothing that really interrupts what they're doing here. This should have some viable appeal to fans of death doom metal and funeral death doom metal alike. So nothing really tasteless happening here, but nothing all that exciting either. So I think if you're a fan of the first Brutality record or the early Sound of Monstrosity, you're going to appreciate this style of Vaticinal Rites. This is a London, England-based old school death metal band, and one who incorporates quite a lot of kind of shredding and kind of thrashing style into their sound. It's not exactly a death thrash metal record, but it does aim for the 80s conscious, early 90s style of death metal, and they get that sound across really quickly within shorter songs. They stick to kind of a 3 or 4 minute death metal song style, and they don't overextend themselves into too many indulgent or breakdown filled sounds. So this is a very straightforward classic death metal kind of record, and I don't think it suffers for it. I think this is a solid record, and I think it's a lot better than their EP was a couple of years ago. The only thing I would say is that this is probably not going to be exciting for people who are looking for something decidedly new sounding. To me, this is a very comfortable, solid release that is just good quality across the board, fine album art, great lyrics. Everything feels like it kind of locks into place here. And so I'm not jumping out of my chair with excitement for it, but every time I pick this up, it was completely solid, and I like the style they're working with. I think it needs to be a little bit more tuneful to really get me to stick with it, because there's so many options for this kind of thing. So maybe the shredding gets you, maybe some of the more thrash-oriented riffs will hook you in, but there wasn't that one thing that just said, this is the one, so it might be more for your taste. So definitely give this a chance if you're interested in classic death metal sounds. So at this point, I would not suggest that everyone knows what 6 Feet Under is, and that would maybe include the band over the last 10 years. I guess I'm old enough to have been around when this band started, and I was a fan of Cannibal Corpse when they formed. I was a huge fan of Obituary when they formed, and I thought, that maybe that's going to be the best of both worlds, and it turned out to be a little bit more related to the kind of stony thing that was happening with death metal around the time of Entombed's popularity. They were kind of a death and roll, but also kind of a rock-oriented death metal option that didn't seem all that serious by the time Graveyard Classics and that series began. So if you don't know what 6 Feet Under is, the early records are certainly worth checking out, at least Haunted and the second record. But after that point, they changed quite a bit depending on who joined in. And I won't give the full history here, but I would say back in 2012, when the original key lineup and a lot of those folks had left, Undead was a decent album. They followed it up with kind of a mediocre second kind of leftovers record, but this record is the second that has Jack Owen, the founding guitarist from Cannibal Corpse, along with the vocalist who was originally a founding member of, or an early member of Cannibal Corpse. And with Jack Owen writing all the songs, they achieve a classic death metal sound that is thrashing, but also very much locked into step with the early sound of 6 Feet Under, which was the kind of death and roll feeling. So if the assignment is sound like old 6 Feet Under, this record does it pretty well. And I do have nostalgia for the early stuff like Haunted. I don't know that this is exactly as good as Haunted, or if that record was even all that good to begin with, to be honest. But uh, there is an appreciable quality here in terms of making an effort to sound like a classic old version of themselves, and this is much better than they've done in the last 10 plus years for my taste. I think it's easy to talk about this band like they're a meme. I think they definitely put out a lot of pretty bad records over the years. I wouldn't say this is one of their worst. I think it's one of their better records. In fact, I think if it wasn't so long and there weren't so many songs on here and they'd kind of cut it off at that sweet spot, it actually would have been a solid record that I would have recommended. Here, I'm not sure. I think that the overall package is pretty impressive in terms of the album art and the kind of over the top Cannibal Corpse feeling of it all. But I wouldn't say that this is buttoned up enough to really make that impact for the old school death metal fan. It's not bad, you know. I think that's where I'm going to leave that. You know, I've got nothing squarely negative to say about this record. And finally, we have an epic heavy metal record, a heavy power metal act named Flamekeeper from Marco Vermiglio. He's best known for his work in Demonomancy. I think the thing to note here is that I figured this was much more of a Bathory-esque project, and in some ways it is. It does speak to the human spirit in the same way that Corthon did on some records, but this is much more of a traditional heavy metal record that is centered around power metal melodies and kind of aiming for memorable songs that strike out in a performative way. I think they're instantly recognizable here. The songs are very catchy off the bat. I also think they're a little bit awkward. You know, it is kind of a power metal record. It has some German power metal influence as far as I'm concerned, but I don't think there's enough of their crunchier kind of speed metal aggression here that we feel on some of the songs to round out the experience. A lot of the songs become a little bit samey, and that wouldn't bother me if it wasn't a half-an-hour record. So it's just about right for a debut. It gets in and out pretty quickly, and it tells you exactly who they are in a very a pretty bold personality. But I wanted more. You know, I wanted something a little bit more well-rounded as a full listen, and something that stuck. It showed us that, you know, he's also still about the riffs, because I know what this fellow can do in terms of putting songs together, but I wanted to hear more of the aggressive side of it to sort of nail their point home and round out a more cohesive record, because this is a collection of just their best songs. I'm sure it's very solid overall, but it just wasn't. It was just the same type of song over and over for my taste, and it was a little bit one note. That's all.
It's the golden spark coming from your heart. You better